This house that I'm sitting in, well, this room rather, in the house, is the greatest real estate investment I've ever made in my life, by far, and it's actually responsible for adding $500,000 to my overall net worth. Now, that's a really great, happy, rainbowy story as I tell it on YouTube right now, but it wasn't always really that simple. When I bought this house, I really didn't feel like I could afford it. And it's because I couldn't. I had a lot of student loan debt, I had credit card debt, but I was living down the road paying $1,850 in rent to a landlord. And after doing that for a few months in a 600 square foot apartment with 2 dogs and my wife, I just got kind of fed up with it. And I said, you know what, let's buy a house. And my wife was like, can we afford it? And I was like, not really. But the way I was kind of approaching it was not necessarily can I afford it, but how can I afford it? That's what I would always ask myself. And I remember that I was looking on Zillow, looking at every single property on the low end of house ranges here, which it was like 500,000 to 800,000 was the price for most properties in Los Angeles at that time. Well, in my respective budget. And I remember looking at every house and just seeing, was there a studio apartment or was there an extra room that I could build a wall and a door and rent that out separately? And the reason I was doing this was because a few years before this, I was actually living in Kansas City in a $159,000 house. And at that time, I didn't know it was called this, but I was house hacking. I was renting a room in that property, and I was charging a friend $400 every single month. My mortgage was $1,100, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like he's paying me $400. Now I'm only paying $700 a month, and that was actually a little cheaper than the apartment I was renting at that time. And so I kind of felt like I was making money. That kind of unlocked something in my brain. And I wanted to really pull that into the world of Los Angeles. And so I started asking myself, how can I buy a house here where I can rent out a room or anything? And then finally I found this house that I'm sitting in right here. And it was $624,000. I only had to put down 3.5%, which at that time with seller credits and everything only amounted to about $18,500. That's how much I paid to get into the $624,000 house. And I remember kind of being embarrassed by that number. And I remember telling my coworkers that I was closing on a house. And I kind of got some congrats from a lot of them. But I also kind of got it was more like a congrats. And I could tell that they were thinking in their head like, we make more money than you and we can't afford to buy a house. So what's the story here? And what I had calculated was that this house had this room that you see right here. You can't really see too much. I mean, I'll show you. It's all decommissioned right now. This is basically storage for me now. It's not really all that nice. But at the time, it was a diamond in the rough for me. And it didn't actually look like this. It was way worse. I remodeled it from the ground up. I spent 8 hours a night for like 2 months getting it into this condition, if you can believe it. And basically what happened was I saw this house. I saw that it had this little studio apartment underneath it, which was 279 square feet. I mean, I guess not was, it still is. It's 279 square feet. And I had calculated that if I rented this house on Airbnb, I could basically make $2,000 to $3,000 a month in Airbnb rent. Why that's impactful was because at that time, my mortgage was $4,400. And so basically, if I could pay $2,000 to $3,000 of my $4,400 mortgage, I could pay 50 to 75% of my mortgage. And when I calculated that, I was like, that's how I'm going to make it work. I can't afford $4,400. There's no way I was ever going to afford it. But, $2,200 to $2,500, I could afford that. And at that point, I had also Airbnb'd the first apartment I'd ever lived in, and that was making like $1,000, $2,000 every single month. So between my first Airbnb, which at that time was arbitrage, and this little studio cranking out $2,000 to $3,000, I actually wasn't paying a mortgage. And I remember just feeling like I had stumbled upon something really just brilliant. And again, I didn't really know the concept of house hacking at that point. I just knew people were paying me money and my mortgage was a lot cheaper. And it just felt so good. Now, you may know the rest of the story from here. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I basically went on to build another tiny house in the backyard, which is an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, because Los Angeles actually made it very easy or much easier to build on your property at that time. It didn't used to be easy. It used to actually be really, really hard. But they passed some law that basically made it so that I could go out, get a permit, and yada, yada, yada. I built that thing for $72,000. And the reason I was so motivated to do it was because I remember on the months that I made $3,000 on this property, I was just kind of like, holy moly, what if I could do that like again? And I was standing in my backyard thinking about how much money I was making relative to that time, looking at my backyard and thinking, man, this is a pretty big backyard. So I ended up building the tiny house as a result. And it was always kind of tough. Like I was basically in a live-in flip. The hard part about this was my wife was super supportive and always super down. And she was always along the ride with me, along for the ride with me, and supportive, but also kind of always like, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to get us into this?" And I was always like, "I think it's gonna work." And we actually remodeled this house. We've remodeled it, I don't know, 4 or 5 times at this point. It's kind of one of those things where there's still some aspects of this house that still exist, but it's all kind of remodeled from different phases and aesthetics in my life. It's not really the best house ever, but it's my house, and over time I've remodeled it, and over time I've just seen the value of my house go up more and more and more and more. Bought it for $624, then it was worth $750, then it was worth $850, then it was worth $950, and now, comps would put this anywhere from 1.1 to 1.3. I would say probably in that 1.2, $1.25 million range right now. But on the low end, we'll say 1.1 million bucks. And I owe 600,000 on it, 650, something like that. So that's what I say. My net worth on this property, my equity in this property is about $500,000. And there were just so many times where it felt really hard. I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. Like, it was tough. The reason I remodeled my own house so many times is because I just didn't have the money to pay contractors. I have the ability to speak Spanish, which is great. And there were many times where I went to Home Depot and talked to my Mexican brothers, and I said, "Hola amigo, ¿me puedes ayudar con un proyecto?" And I would just basically hire labor that I could manage myself, and then I would do a lot of the work myself. And I was always negotiating and wheeling and dealing and trying to get a really good deal because I just could not afford a fancy contractor. And there were so many times where I just got myself into so many predicaments that I really shouldn't have been in, but I was just really destined to, or I was really just motivated to build a nice house and a nice life for me and my wife, and I knew one day it would pay off. And it's been really cool because it kind of has paid off. And I don't live in LA anymore. I live in Houston, Texas now. But why I love this house so much is because it really does give way, and it really does kind of solidify why I got into Airbnb to begin with. And the whole purpose of like why I wanted to build a portfolio, which was to own a house in an area that I could go and visit with my family anytime I wanted to. And I don't really make it a point to visit any of my Airbnbs the way that I intended with that dream, but I still own this house. And I come to this house 2-3 weeks out of the year, and I still get to enjoy this house and live in LA. And there's so many times where I wanted to sell this house, but I just can't do it. I'm breaking the number one rule in real estate, which is having sentimental attachment to one of your properties. But this was my home for 5 years, and it's been really cool that I actually have the optionality on this property, and I have for so many years, to pretty much do whatever I want. At this time, my mortgage is $4,200, so it's relatively low. My tiny house is a midterm rental, makes, right now it's rented out for $3,000 a month. Sometimes I have 2 or 3 month vacancies on it. So when you kind of average it all out, I make about $2,000 a month there. When this is rented, the upstairs as a midterm rental, that's anywhere from $5,500 to $6,500. Again, there's vacancy there. So when you all add it together, I make a little bit of money, but I'm, a couple $1,000, $2,000 here and there. And then I've got this little studio right here. I showed you, it's kind of dirty. It's not really a rental at the moment, and the reason I chose not to make it a rental was because it used to be an Airbnb, and then one of my tenants was like, "Hey, I really like it. Can I live here?" And I was like, "Sure." They lived here for a couple years, and then it got kind of gross. And truthfully, when we moved, I was just kind of like, I like my neighbors. They like me. Everyone, there's a good equilibrium in the neighborhood. I just didn't want 3 sets of people on my property, and I didn't want to have to manage 3 tenants at once, kind of thing. while I was out of town. And so I never really did anything with this property. But now, now that I've kind of thought about it, I sort of want to rebuild this property that you see right here, this little studio, and make it nice, paint it white, change out the baseboards, make it kind of nice and shiny again, redo the shower. Because I was looking at comps the other day, and this property can basically make about $2,000 a month. So on a fully operational month, we're looking at $2,000 down here, $3,000 in the backyard, and then upstairs we'll call it like $5,000. So you add that all up together, $10,000 a month. I have to write it out to do simple math. $10,000 a month on a $4,400 mortgage. When you factor in all my expenses and everything like that, because they're mostly midterm rentals, I'm not paying a ton of cleaning fees or anything like that. So we'll call it like $5,500 to $5,700. So I basically can cash flow like $3,000 or $4,000 a month on this property, and I get to use it whenever I want. And that's kind of a full circle moment for me, because I know it sounds very basic, and I always talk about buying these cash flowing machines and having this Airbnb portfolio. But I wanted to make this video because I sit in the studio often when I'm in LA, and I make content and I do work down here. And it just kind of causes me to reflect on why it is that I even got into Airbnb. And I got into it for the very simple reason that I wanted to buy things that other people paid for. And I got to live in my dream home. It wasn't all that nice, but it was my dream home because it was my dream to live in LA with my wife. And I got other people to pay for it. And so it brings me to this final note that I want to make, which is I think a lot of real estate investors kind of get into real estate for the wrong reasons, or let me rephrase that. A lot of real estate investors have their eyes set on the wrong thing, and a lot of people want to get into real estate, and they want to build these portfolios where they make $10,000 a month, and they want to quit their 9 to 5 and all that stuff. It's possible. I've done it. I've helped thousands of people do it at this point. I know that it can be done. But they just want to buy that rental property, and they're like, hey, Rob, what's the advice for me? Like, if I can get started in Airbnb, or if I could get started in real estate, what do I have to do? Tell me, coach me. And the answer is actually really quite simple. I think the best way to break into real estate is to own your own home. Because when you own your own home, it just gives you options. It gives you so many options. I told you the story of this LA house, but before I moved here, I lived in Kansas City. And in Kansas City, I bought that house for $159,000. I owned it for 3 years. Poor. We were so broke. And 3 years after that, it appreciated to $215,000, and we sold it, made $40,000 after all of our fees, and moved to LA with $40,000 in our bank account. And because we had $40,000, we could afford the $18,500 down payment on this property. And because I bought this property, I got a home equity line of credit that I was able to then use to go out and build Casa Conejo. And because of that, I was able to cash out and get all my money back and do it over and over and over and over again. And so I know that it's not the sexiest answer to say, hey, just buy a house and live in it and don't cash flow, but it's my answer. Every house that I've purchased and lived in has added really amazing equity and money to my net worth. This house, I bought a house in Tennessee that I lived in for a year. I bought that thing for $500. It's worth like $850,000 now. And I've only owned it for 3 or 4 years. Now, I bought these properties at an ideal time. And, that's kind of one thing that people always say, well, you bought when interest rates were low, blah, blah, blah. Well, the truth is, no matter when you buy real estate, if you hold on to it for 30 years, you're going to look like a genius. And truthfully, when I tell people about this house, they're already kind of like, dude, I cannot believe you got that house for $624,000. And I was like, well, when I bought it, I was scared. I was scared out of my mind. And truthfully, every house that I've bought as a primary house, I've always been scared of, because it was always something that was just out of reach, but I made it work through house hacking. And so if you're thinking about getting into the real estate game, there's so many ways you can do it. But I think first and foremost, if you're willing to, I think you should buy a house. I think you should rent out a room or a basement or a studio or whatever you want to call it. And I think you should use that money and save it until you can go out and buy more rental properties. That's a strategy that hasn't just worked for me, but it's worked for so many people. So never underestimate the power of buying a real estate, or never underestimate the power of buying a primary residence. I know it doesn't get you closer to building this crazy huge portfolio, but it gets you in a home that you own that can make you $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in equity over the course of owning it for 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years. So that's my spiel today. This is the best real estate investment I've ever made. It's worth a lot more than I paid for it. And 30 years from now, whenever I retire, it's probably going to be worth $2-3 million bucks. And at that time, everyone's going to be like, dude, I can't believe you bought that thing for $624,000. That's like $1 in today's money. And I'm going to be like, yeah, I took a chance on myself and I believe that I could do it. And I did. Hope this was helpful. Hopefully it gets you thinking. If it did, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you on next week's episode. See you. Bye.